thank you so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I would like to talk really about the book because that's the reason I was invited about it. And the book is co-edited with two colleagues. One of, both of them, Chris Lubienski, University of Illinois, and Antoni Verger. And both of them, all three of us have brought different expertise to that edited volume. And we managed to get amazing scholars to contribute to it. But let me just, because that will help you to understand what I'll be saying right now, the expertise that we brought to that book project. Christopher Lubienski is an expert on school reform in the US with a strong emphasis on the charter school movement, on the involvement of foundations in policy, like the business and the foundations as important policy actors. Antoni Verger wrote very early pieces on GATS and cross-national trade and global education industry. He also has a lot of experience in developing countries. My expertise is different. For me, that was the first piece even thinking about the private sector. My thing is globalization and education. And I write about policy borrowing and lending, about traveling reforms. And of course, in recent years, the private sector has become one of the biggest disseminators of reforms. So my question is always, and I use here Tony's great expression, why do governments buy into reforms? Or in this case now, why do governments buy into or even literally buy reform packages sold by businesses? So my question is always about the logic, the reason, and this is because I come more from systems theory. I'm trying to understand the different way of thinking between businesses as education providers and between governments. So just to give you an idea, a talk that I'll be giving next week in Kuwait in the Gulf Comparative Education Society is about the need to stop thinking only like a state or seeing like a state, to use James Scott's great book, and starting to think like a business in education. Why is the education sector so attractive to the business, and how do they turn the public sector into a business type operation? So that's my motivation for doing this book, and this is our division of labor. So let me just talk about this, what I said, the need to really take a paradigm shift in critical educational research. The whole scholarship on governmentality, and a lot of it draws on Foucault and translated into education by by Popkowitz, but also Stephen Ball. It's all about trying to look at the public education as an instrument of the state and how the state manipulates education, reproduces inequality inadvertently or advertently, etc. And the stratification replicated in education. That's what a lot of critical studies is in education, or sociology of education. Now, the new body of research is now opening up in trying to understand how the private sector has shaped the way we think in education, what we value in education, how we run education, or govern it, and how we fund it. So this is my interest in that research topic. And I'm suggesting that, we shouldn't be just seeing like a state and trying to understand the logic of public education, but we should start seeing like a business to see how this works. Antoni Verger at the CIS conference, that presentation, he has figures that this group knows a lot about the private sector and the global education industry. I don't need to go into detail, just to say it is massively expanding, and everyone is in awe, trying to understand. First, the first generation of scholars just showed that it is a topic, and I think we are beyond that stage of accepting that the global education industry is expanding and trying to understand. I like the minimum definition of global education industry that Antoni Verger uses. He says there are three things: the provision of services or goods. The second one is it has to do with education. And the third definition is it has to cross national boundaries. So these are the three definitions of global education industry. And as part of the second part, when we talk about education, it has to be for profit. So it is banned across national boundaries. It has to be for profit in education, and it has to deal with services and goods. So just one figure from the GVA group about the expansion of the education. This is that I was referring to. So the way we try to invite scholars that not only talk about private schooling or private tutoring, which is a well-covered topic, but also about consultancy services, about certification industry, but also about foundations and the private sectors as backstage policy advisors or even front stage policy advisors. The new topic, which is a relatively new phenomenon, is not only private schools in individual countries, but across countries, like chains, global chains, such as in developing countries, the ones that are supported by the Pearson Affordable Learning Fund, like Omega. You have here bridge schools, but then also you have non-for-profit, but maybe profit organization like Teach for All, IB, but then GEMS, which is a big business originating in Dubai, but
is it?
I lost the image, but I keep talking. So
is your screen still shared?
You can still see the PowerPoint, right? I don't see you guys.
No.
You don't see the PowerPoint?
Not anymore now.
Oh, okay, sorry. Technical glitch. Let me go back.
Share screen, yeah, share screen, please. Then you will be able to share your presentation.
Okay. Are we all back again? Yes?
Not yet. Not yet.
Wow.
Perhaps you could just keep talking without the PowerPoint, I guess, if it doesn't work. Yeah.
Don't see the PowerPoint. No?
No, we don't see it.
So let me just talk. Let me look into my own screen. There's a couple of things. Question is, why is the business so interested in the education sector, which is a relatively new discovery at that scale? And there are four things that I just want to point out. There are more reasons, but let me focus on four. One is the economy of scale. The second one is what I would call payment before results. You get paid before you deliver, actually, in the education sector. The third is that you're able to do service contracts. And the fourth one is access to a global market. Let me talk about those. The first one, economy of scale. There are only two sectors that are that huge in terms of clients. One is health and one is education, because everyone has some health issues at one point or the other, and the other one is education. It's an economy of scale, especially these days with the whole discussion and the whole concept and economies of talking about the knowledge economy, but also within the knowledge economy and the education sector, the talk about lifelong learning. Lifelong learning means there is education across the lifespan, not only at school, and there is formal and non-formal education. So school is not the only educative site where education takes place, and it is with the emphasis on learning, and lifelong learning is also the emphasis on effective learning. And this is something with the move from input-based to outcomes-based education that was a global education reform. A lot of emphasis is on an accredited learning, or that there's a proof that you learned something and you get a paper at the end of the day. So there is masses of people in that sector because of that whole connection of knowledge society, lifelong learning, then the rising middle class in developing countries, which is starting with 1990s, one would say, in development studies with the Education for All movement, and now more recently with the Rights to Education Act, countries, in India, South Africa, now also Pakistan. There are masses of people, or the way businesses looks at it, customers in that sector. The other one is what I call payment before results. One is that there is with the discussion we have in development studies that some agencies are working towards delivery-based payments rather than giving grants. They give it retroactively, and there's a really interesting debate going on this issue, and very controversial. And the other one is that education is something, even though you test it and you have standardized tests, you really, especially when it comes to skills or competencies, which is now the move of the last 10, 20 years, you really don't know if what you teach and what students learn is useful for later on in life. You just pretend it's useful by creating. Education is always something that you only know the result of it really 10 or 20 years later. We have a whole term in systems theory. Niklas Luhmann says that education has a technology deficit because you never know really whether it worked much later on. So this is actually also interesting for businesses to get involved. The third one is what I call a service contract. You know, when you buy a copy machine, you also buy the service contract that goes with it, toner that only works with that machine and not with another machine, or a cable that only works with that machine or the other. Businesses work exactly that way. The way, for instance, IB, even though it's not for profit, you cannot just use the grade. I like the curriculum, so don't get me wrong. I'm not criticizing the content of IB, the International Baccalaureate. But if you have an IB test, you cannot just have the test. You have to have the textbooks, you have the teacher training that goes with it, you have standards, you have the philosophy, the concept, you have it's a whole package. The same when you buy, so governments have to buy, or schools have to buy the whole package. And it is usually a reverse curriculum development. You buy the test, and then you buy the standards, the textbooks, the teacher education package that goes with it. Same with Cambridge Education, another standardized test. They're active in Mongolia, for instance. You have to buy the whole package. And the argument is, they make the quality argument that the reason why they do that is because you cannot just, you have to teach students in a particular way to get those test results. But this makes it very interesting because it binds education systems into a service contract. It's like a long-term commitment. It's not just buying a test or the copies of that test, but it's buying a whole teacher education system and the curriculum framework and textbooks. That's what I call service contract. Plus, it is a closed system. It's not compatible with other systems, which makes education really, really interesting. It's like buying into Microsoft or Apple, and not having the systems talk to each other because they are in themselves closed systems. That's another point, and that's just, by the way, just a side comment. This is something that might be appealing to governments that buy that, especially in developing contexts, where donors all pull in different directions. One, USAID supporting textbook development, World Bank supporting test development, another donor, doing teacher education. So this might be an appealing part actually for governments, that it's coherent. It is coherent, but it is a dependency, and it is very expensive because you have to buy the whole package. Another reason why the education sector is interesting is there's access to a global market. There is, when you look at privatization in education, there's like two developments. One is an expansion that comes from elite schools that become more and more widespread. And another one is in low-income countries where low-cost or low-fee private schools are expanding massively. And the argument is different for the different types of expansion of the private sector. The one that we are used to is student mobility, which is more the elite kind of schooling. And this is like coming down from higher education to secondary education and to primary and early childhood. In higher education, the emphasis has all, the reason why there's privatization in higher education is fully realized is because there is the whole, it's a huge business for them because you have tuitions in higher education, and the private sector can move into higher education and argue with student mobility that you're preparing, like in developing countries, you have English-speaking private universities that are accredited by some university or some association outside the country. What we are moving now into, which is a new development, is privatization in secondary school. And I'm not talking about, elite secondary schools or K-12 schools, but I'm talking about, for instance, Indonesia introducing the so-called international standard school, which was an experiment for a couple of years that changed and was suspended. There was a lot of protest and was very controversial. But when you look at it, the international standard school movement, and in general, not only in Indonesia, but in Mongolia, in Kazakhstan, in many countries, you have a bunch of schools that the governments say that they want to use as centers of excellence, with the argument that will eventually spill over to surrounding schools, and it never does. But this is always the assumption why you spend so much money on those international standard schools. There are usually two things that make them international. One is English as a language of instruction, and the other one is technology. These are the two prevalent features of schools that have so-called international standards. The third, some countries more rigorous than others, is sometimes they're accredited by schools or education systems, or they're emulated after examples of schools in OECD. So this is a new trend to have at that scale international schools at the secondary school that are non-elite schools, that use public funding for private schools, either by paying through voucher schemes, and it is institutionalized by ways of vouchers, so that the neoliberal reforms that enables parents to have choice in combination with a competitive process, with per capita financing, where schools get money per student rather than incremental budgeting, that all incentivizes schools to open up to private providers. And this is, I would say, really a new phenomenon that is happening. When you look at the slides later on, you'll see I have this example from the international standard schools in Indonesia, but also other examples. But I find it interesting that it's usually those two phenomenon of technology and English as the selling point for international standard schools or international schools. And in some countries, as I said, it's also certification by school systems in OECD countries. Then the new forms, when I say that the business also introduced new ways of governance, new ways of thinking, conceptualizing education, it's also new ways of PPPs, public-private partnerships in education. And one of them is that even the public sector has been getting used in the US for sure to charge fees for some services. And one could say maybe that was the opening the door for businesses to get into public schools. That public education has started 20, 30 years ago in the US to define what is core, what should be free, and what should be paid in addition, starting with after-school programs, special classes, but in some district, music education or physical education, everything that is not considered core in some countries. So this is already, we never called it that way, but maybe retroactively we should call it PPP because it is just the core that is free and everything else has a fee structure. It is like having like a premium subscription or just a basic subscription. So public education, creepingly without noticing it, has already adopted the thinking, the logic of businesses of today with the fee structure that basic education in public education is free, but for everything else you pay. In some countries more than others. Like in some countries you pay massive or even for additional service in public education. Let me move on here to leave time. How much time do we have for? Do you give me?
Yeah, maybe about 10 more minutes. Yeah.
10 minutes?
Yeah.
So what I find interesting is this new development from no-cost education, like on the government side, if you have government as a provider, no-cost education, to introducing no-cost education, but only for basic services, and then asking parents for everything extra. And we have that already now, and I say in some countries the extra is a lot of extra, including some people would say the whole private tutoring is a whole debate that fits into that sector of an unspoken PPP that existed actually in many countries. So the new phenomenon with businesses as provider is that in developing countries where I work, there's a strong push by Pearson Affordable Learning Fund, and DFID is supporting it, which is the UK Agency for Development and Cooperation, but also USAID and World Bank. They're pushing for low-cost school reform in especially South Asia, but also African countries. And the low cost and Omega and Bridge, their claim to fame is that they have low cost schooling, affordable schooling, what they call. And rather than getting the money from parents as low fee, they get it low cost and get the money from agencies, from the government. So you have both low fee schools where the money comes from parents, the fee. This is what used to be called one dime a day schools. But then you have low cost schools where the money comes from DFID or from governments or from loans and international grants, right? So the idea of these, there is a blurred line, I'm trying to say, between low cost and low fee schools and vouchers, because the hope of these businesses is to have the kind of neoliberal reform where you can get vouchers for all types of schools, so that the government ends up subsidizing, not only subsidizing, just paying for low fee private schools. So that's a new development that we are witnessing. Just today, the next featured article in the Comparative Ed Review is by Antoni Verger, Bolal, and someone else, I forgot the name, I'm sorry, on the Chile experiment and vouchers. So they looked at the inequality that resulted as a result of privatization and the voucher scheme in Chile, which was the earliest case of introduction of the voucher scheme. The other thing I wanted to mention, that's the fourth issue, is the meaning of PISA. The fact that there are transnational businesses, and remember we talk about the global education industry as a transnational provider, that's an important differentiation. Fits really well with the new development of PISA that now is in a union with Pearson as a test development and the use of technology for this. The move away from national curriculum or IEA type of studies like TIMSS and PEARLS and what have you, to a transnational curriculum in the form of PISA, because PISA doesn't measure national curriculum anymore. It measures 21st century skills among 15-year-olds. Is a huge step towards enabling transnational providers, because transnational providers or businesses, they depend on an economy of scale to even enter the education sector. So the fact that we now have a global set of standards developed by PISA in collaboration with Pearson, and that where there's a minimal link with national curricula, is a huge benefit for businesses to move in. And what we also have in concurrence at the same time, we have, and we looked into that really nicely into a study with Denmark, we have a whole, what I call a scandalization industry emerging. Those league tables where it's, you know, who is on the bottom of the pyramid, who is on the top of the pyramid, who are the league leaders. We have PISA helping to trash public education and to say how poorly things work. And the same Pearson and other businesses then develop solutions to fix the education system by testing it, by monitoring, but also by developing textbooks and teacher education and whatnot. So this whole loop, we would call that it's a self-preferential system. The same organizations that scandalize and say how bad the education system is are also the ones supporting solutions, offering solutions, fixing it, monitoring it, approving it, and implementing it. It's a totally closed, self-preferential system. And we could see that, you know, in studies that we did, how there is a close collaboration between, and the book talks a lot about it. There are a couple of chapters on that issue, how governments work with businesses and testing industries and in implementing education reform. So that confusion between diagnosing a problem and prescribing the solution, that overlap is a huge conflict of interest if you would look at it in that way, because it's the same organization doing it. The last point I wanted to make is the important role of OECD and PISA studies to set in motion education reform, because they generate reform pressure by showing that there is a need for improving reform. So, and in my other research and policy borrowing, I always say that it is a quasi-external pressure. It is internally induced. The governments themselves invite OECD to come in to say how bad the system is, so they can get a quasi-external reform pressure on their own education system to push through reforms. So the impact, to summarize, the impact of the private sector on the public sector. Remember I said my interest is to understand what is the logic of the private sector that is now swapping over to the public sector education, is not only what Stephen Ball calls endemic privatization, that we have, you know, demand and supply driven and marketization and commercialization of education, but also the whole idea of having low production costs. the cheapening of teacher education degrees. We have that very strong in the US, that states start to accredit cheaper than university-based teacher education, which is a huge problem for universities that offer teacher education. So the whole idea of having low production costs in education is really being implemented now. Then the introduction of a fee structure, that's also business thinking in public sector. Then the inequality that is being undone by scholarships and loan for socially disadvantaged groups. And finally, the idea that education should be something that should be transferable to other countries. So the whole idea of a global curriculum, 21st century skills, English as a language of instruction, technology. And this is also something that is coming from pushed by the private sector and adopted by the public sector, which is the last point that then feeds into why the private sector is such an effective disseminator of global education reform, because it's the biggest beneficiary of standard-based, globalized education reform. I should end here and start the discussion.